Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for today's Che Alaska Call, a program of Alaska Community Action on Toxics, Che being a collaborative for health in the environment. My name is Adam Ortega. I am the communications coordinator for Alaska Community Action on Toxics. And today we're going to be talking about the falsehood of critical and strategic minerals. So under the Department of the Interior, critical and strategic minerals are defined as basically minerals or some type of cobalt, copper, zinc that is essential to national security. However, environmental justice advocates say that this is a camouflage used by the mining industry to shortcut permitting processes, public comment periods, and it's just another guise, if you will. Now, before we get started, I do want to say that, again, Che Alaska is a program of ACAT. It's also part of Che's broader international coalition of over 5,000 individuals across the globe dedicated to providing credible environmental health news across the lifespan. I will say also that last week, the supplemental environmental impact statement for the Ambler Road was released. There's a 60-day comment period to the public. And for those who are unfamiliar, the Ambler Road is a proposed 211-mile road going across the Dalton Highway in northern interior Alaska. And it would cut right through gates of the Arctic, which is super nasty. It would disrupt caribou migration patterns, as well as the 66 native communities around it. And although it is right now a private road, you would obviously have pressure to open that up as well. So that is what's happening right now. That's how it's relating to Alaska. I do want to introduce our very special speakers today. We are joined by Austin Ahmasuk, who is the Environmental Justice Co-Director for Native Movement in Anchorage, and they have a Fairbanks office as well, Alaska nonprofit. And then we're also joined by Bonnie Gestring, Program Director for Earthworks, who is doing some of this great work as well. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Austin to get us started. Thank you both for being here.
Hey, thank you, Adam, and thanks to ACAT, and thank you for everybody joining. Why should we care about critical minerals? Well, I certainly hope after today's talk that we all ask the serious question of why critical mineral development might be a false solution. As Adam mentioned, I work for a Native Movement. It's a relatively small grassroots organization based in Anchorage and Fairbanks, and it centers its work around indigenized worldviews, just transition, environmental justice, climate justice, gender justice, as well as really significant community education components, all in the name of advocating using traditional advocacy tools, as well as direct action, community organizing, and hopefully you've seen some of our arts in action. My name is Austin Ahmasuk. I come from Middle Clan Inupiaq people on my grandmother's side, and I come from Polarok Inupiaq people on my grandfather's side. So on this issue of critical minerals, I really think that society is teetering on the precipice of a profound transformation. The ability to impact our future could be either or a way of human innovation, or we may spiral into an abyss of additional climate change, additional global warming. And so after today's talk and interaction, I hope that we all consider ways of going forward with diligent foresight, as well as courage to ensure a future that's positive, that's healthy for our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, and so on and so forth, so that we don't have to consider a future in which we're destroying the only place that we can live. So critical minerals have been touted as a green solution, as Adam mentioned, and I think Bonnie will talk about, primarily to reduce air pollution and mitigate climate change. But Critical minerals, if they're used for electrical vehicle generation or electrical energy generation or electrical transportation power, still contribute to pollution in many different kinds of ways, particularly their manufacturing process, especially if we're talking about lithium-ion batteries. The mining of those materials can and do have significant impacts on the environment, which I'll get into. The process of mining those raw materials often, unfortunately, is taking place on ancestral lands, cultural lands, indigenous lands. And when this happens in those areas, of course, it can lead to deforestation or changes to the habitat or destruction of the habitat. And particularly in the case of hard rock critical mineral development that I'll get into, there are some very significant soil and water pollution issues that need to be taken into consideration. And then we need to talk about how electrical energy is generated, right? It's going to come from some kind of power source. Unless that power source is totally carbon free, we're still going to be contributing to greenhouse gas emissions. And then the issue of disposal and recycling. These materials poses really significant environmental challenges because of their complex composition, as well as their potential toxicity. So we have to think about really crucial steps going forward. Again, we have to be diligent with our foresight, and we do have to understand that critical minerals, which are touted as a green solution, they are not pollution free. And so we have to think about how we, mitigate those impacts. I'm going to talk about a project in my home region on the Seward Peninsula. I was born and raised in Nome. I lived there until 2021, and I've been living in Palmer now. But I have close connections. I travel back there frequently. I'm going to be talking about the Graphite 1 mine in the Kigluyik Mountains, just north of Nome, just south of the Imrock Basin. The Kigluyik Mountains is a mountain range in the middle of the Seward Peninsula. The word Kigluyik is a Inupiaq word, which means wind that comes from everywhere. It is an ancestral mountain range for me and for other people that use that area, who come from that area. It is also a ancestral sacred place that contributes to our culture, our livelihood. It has contributed to our legends. It gives us place. It gives us a sense of where we come from. And the graphite mine in the Kigluyik Mountains is right next to a very significant water body. It's the largest watershed on the Seward Peninsula. It provides a home and refuge for all kinds of subsistence resources that we utilize. And so the graphite mine is presently in the exploration phase, and it is getting a lot of attention, of course, which I'm going to talk about. But first, I want to talk about the potential impacts that I see from this critical mineral mine, the Graphite 1 mine, if you will. If you want to know more about the Graphite 1 mine, I think you can just simply Google Graphite 1. You can get their materials, go to the website, and you can download their pre-feasibility report. It's a report on their environmental study as well as their mine scenarios. Relatively complex read, around 300 or so, around 300 pages, as I recall, but a very important read. The potential graphite mine, I think, will and has the potential to lead to very significant environmental damage of an ancestral area, an important area that's utilized for subsistence, an important area that's utilized for habitat refuge, fish and wildlife refuge. And it certainly has the ability and potential to disrupt the landscape and very significantly potentially contaminate water bodies that are near that mine. And the problem, of course, with that is that the state of Alaska has very poor environmental regulations, some of the poorest in the nation. And as I will talk about a little later, I think that there's potential for mine operators to seek the least amount of regulation possible and the least amount of oversight. The graphite mine from the pre-feasibility study is going to have some very significant water management challenges. They are going to have to tackle with some very complex water management issues that are going to impact their mining operation. So the problem with large-scale hard rock mining is that these really invasive mining practices are going to be tapping into unmineralized ore bodies, bodies that have over millions of years come into homeostasis and equilibrium, and then once we start tapping into that unmineralized ore body, there's a potential for those ore bodies to liberate some very toxic metals. And we know from the pre-feasibility study of the Graphite 1 mine that a good portion of the waste material, of the waste ore, is going to go acidic. It's going to be potentially acid generating. And this poses a significant risk for the environment as well as human health, because once a hard rock mine goes acidic and there aren't strong water management practices in place, heavy metals, arsenic, lead, iron, so forth can be liberated into the environment. And so one area that is, very concerning for me is this large, immense water body that communities on the Serpents make use of for salmon, for other kinds of fish, waterfowl. This has some potential to, really cause some significant problems for people and the environment. And so we don't know how Graphite 1 is going to manage all those really complex water management issues. Are they going to, inject that groundwater, inject those wastewaters into the ground? Perhaps, we don't know. We do know from Graphite 1's pre-feasibility study that they're evaluating water treatment by injecting and diverting and disposing of wastewater into the Imrock Basin. The Imrock Basin, of course, is a large inland water body that is host and refuge for salmon and non-salmon species, as well as waterfowl and marine mammals. And we know from their pre-feasibility study that Graphite 1 is considering and evaluating a future scenario in which they are going to address water quality regulations for the Imrock Basin. Right? So what does that mean? Well, I think if I am reading that scenario correctly, they're considering how they can maybe change water quality regulations so that wastewater can be treated or discharged into the Imrock Basin. And if that's the case, we'll have to wait and see. But if that's the case, then that's, I think, a very significant problem. The Graphite 1 mine, the potential Graphite 1 mine, is going to need to be able to refine that material on site for shipment out, and then once it's shipped out, it's going to be refined again. And so it is going to be, of course, very energy intensive. It's going to require transportation, as they say, potentially now possibly to the state of Washington for final refinement. But when we look at all the things that the Graphite 1 mine needs to do, they need to get a road to the mine, right? Potentially, they're going to be getting a free road from the state of Alaska. We know that they're going to be getting potentially a free deep water port. We know that the Department of Defense granted Graphite 1 $37.5 million of U.S. taxpayer dollars. My own native corporation, Bering Straits Native Corporation, invested $2 million, all for a foreign mining company. A foreign mining company is going to be getting a lot of free things. So we as taxpayers, we as shareholders of Native corporations and this people of the state of Alaska, we're subsidizing a foreign company's profit essentially. And I think that's a really significant issue. I think that, I mean, it meets what I would consider the definition of a false solution, right? Investing and subsidizing a foreign company's profit for this idea of critical mineral development. There are lots of geological, geotechnical risks that we're not totally sure of yet. They're still figuring out how their ore body and their mine features are going to be working into the future. But this whole notion that a graphite mine like the one in Nome and across the country are getting these free things in order to conduct their operation, and a lot of these companies are foreign companies, and that are being subsidized by U.S. taxpayers. So, at Native Movement, we follow a lot of mining issues, and this is one of the issues that is coming onto our radar. I absolutely look forward to discussions that we have for this webinar, as well as questions that you might have. If you want to reach out to me, you can go to the Native Movement website and go to the staff, and my contact information is there. I'd be happy to talk about this mine, other mines, with anybody that's willing to listen. Certainly look for more information from Native Movement about Graphite One. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Austin. And I really appreciate your work, boots on the ground advocacy to make some of this stuff happen. I realize Alaska is in kind of a unique position just because of our reliance on oil and gas and industry. And I do want to mention too that the United States Geological Survey, they released over 50 elements or minerals that they say are critical to this nation's economy, right? Like I said, Alaska is a unique position because of some of the harsh practices that take place. And you make a great point how they're getting a free road off of this and how a foreign company is getting the money, right? So there's a lot of bad things happening there. But I am hopeful for the future because of organizations like Native Movement who are giving the Arctic a voice, to get some of this important work done and stopping some of this super harmful extractive industries. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Bonnie Gestring. She's a program director for Earthworks, who's going to talk about the definition of strategic and critical minerals, and how that's kind of a guise for harmful industries to shortcut permitting processes. At the end, we'll have a short time for Q&A. So if you have questions, we encourage you to ask that following Bonnie's presentation. And Bonnie, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and thanks to ACAT for this forum. Let me go ahead and share my screen. I've got a little presentation to share with everyone. How's that look?
Beautiful.
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah, the panel topic this afternoon is one that Earthworks has been grappling with a lot in recent years, because Earthworks' mission is to protect communities and the environment against the adverse effects of mining and energy development while seeking sustainable solutions. And that has become, much more challenging in recent years. We now face a climate crisis that requires the rapid transition away from fossil fuels to renewable sources of energy in order to reduce greenhouse gases. And that infrastructure for this transition, such as electric vehicles and solar panels, require minerals. And we're now seeing this dramatic increase in the demand for these minerals and the subsequent dramatic increase in the demand for mining. And there's no doubt that we need to decarbonize, but it must be a just and equitable transition. And it isn't just and equitable or clean if we're simply replacing one harmful extractive industry, the fossil fuel industry, with another large harmful extractive industry, the mining industry. And we would like to see this as an opportunity moment to transition away from these resource extractive industries towards a more sustainable approach, including a more sustainable way to source these minerals. And we're seeing the industry and others use the clean energy transition and the narrative around the term critical minerals as a push for mining to justify mining of everything, anywhere. And we're really seeing it as used as a justification to try and reduce protections for communities and the environment and via the permitting process and a variety of other mechanisms. The Ambler Road is one example that you just mentioned. This is a huge infrastructure project, and it's being pushed by the companies as a necessary to access this abundance of critical minerals, and yet the mining companies who are pushing this project have yet to demonstrate that there are even viable amounts of these minerals to justify the economics of the project, let alone the enormous impacts associated with the road. We're also seeing gold projects being promoted as a means to access critical minerals. Gold's not a critical mineral. It is used primarily to manufacture jewelry. The U.S. produces more than we consume. So what is a critical mineral? The Energy Act of 2020 defines it as non-fuel mineral, meaning it's not oil or gas, and essential to the economic or national security of the U.S., and which has a supply chain that's vulnerable to disruption. The U.S. Geological Survey, which is within the Department of Interior, is tasked with compiling the critical minerals list. They publish it every 3 years, and it, as you just mentioned, includes a list of about 50 minerals. As you could see from the definition, that term is very broad, and we also are seeing that narrative misused in so many circumstances that we actually prefer to use the term transition minerals to describe the minerals that are important in renewable energy technologies. So why is mining a threat to communities, climate, and ecosystems? So to start with, mining is incredibly carbon intensive. Metal mining and processing is responsible for roughly 10% of global carbon emissions, according to the United Nations. So by focusing just primarily on new mining as a way to source these minerals, it's really exacerbating the very climate crisis that we're trying to solve. Mining operations are also targeting increasingly lower grade deposits, which translates into much larger volumes of waste and greater disturbances. So the richer deposits have been mined, and the industry is now mining these lower grade deposits in more remote locations with significant impacts. Mining is the leading source of toxic releases in the United States, according to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And we're seeing an increased number of mines that will generate water pollution in perpetuity from acid drainage and metals leaching, all with long-term consequences in terms of important freshwater resources and access for communities. And importantly here, there are disproportionate effects to Indigenous people. That has certainly been the case historically, starting with the gold rush and the devastating consequences that had for Native Americans. But though that disproportionate harm is still true today in terms of the vast number of cobalt, copper, lithium, nickel reserves, proposed mines, and processing facilities are largely neighboring Native American reservations in the lower 48 within 35 miles, according to recent research, which means, of course, impacts to areas that are important culturally for subsistence, that are traditional lands. And that's particularly important part of all of this, because those communities that are in many cases most vulnerable to the effects of climate change and have done the least to contribute to the climate crisis are now in a position of once again being on the front lines and most heavily affected. So how do we get away from this? What do we do differently? And to really frame that discussion and our understanding of these issues, I want to quickly walk through some key findings from research conducted by the University of Technology in Sydney, Australia. And one is a set of projections around what the demand for these transition minerals might look like. And then the second is, how can we maintain these minerals without, or how can we obtain these minerals without relying primarily on large scale extraction? So what they found is that the primary demand for these minerals is being driven by transportation, electric vehicles and electric vehicle batteries, and that there are a few minerals that are in particular of most concern because of the increased demand, but also in terms of the impacts, and that includes cobalt, nickel, lithium, manganese, and some rare earth minerals. And then importantly, what the second report found is that there can be a significant reduction in the primary demand for these minerals by 2040 by recycling of electric vehicle batteries in particular, as much as 25 to 55%, depending on the minerals, which would significantly reduce the demand for new mining. But we do need to see important policy interventions put in place in order to incentivize recycling. And I point to the EU battery directive as a good example of where we need to go. It mandates recycled content, longer battery life, and product take-back requirements. It also has due diligence provisions in terms of analyzing where that recycled content is coming from. I also like to see reprocessing of mine waste, so obtaining minerals from obtaining these minerals from the material that's already above ground rather than new mining. An example of that is the Berkeley Pit mine in Montana. It is the nation's largest Superfund site, so there is an enormous amount of waste. It generates acid mine drainage in perpetuity, and that acid mine drainage contains rare earth elements. And they're currently looking at how to concentrate the rare earths in that waste stream and put in a processing facility so rare earths could be removed from that waste stream rather than coming from new mining operations. In addition, of course, recycling isn't going to be enough. We need to really shift the way that we consume and the way that we use transportation. Examples of this include things like both a combination of recycling and smaller car size was found in a recent report by Climate and Communities Project to reduce projected lithium demand by as much as 92% by 2050. But we also need to see just a shift in terms of more efficient and available mass transit to get people around rather than everyone having 3 Teslas in the garage. And we need to see push towards a more circular economy. This is particularly important. And that's just a fancy way of saying designing things so that they use fewer minerals, that they can be recycled, and that they have a longer life, and all of these ways to reduce the need for more minerals. And then, of course, the mining that does occur needs to be held to the highest social and environmental standards. And Austin talked a little bit about this earlier, but even in the US, mining on our federal public lands is still governed today by the 1872 mining law, which is a 150-year-old law enacted under President Ulysses S. Grant. At the time, it was enacted and was a big part of colonizing the West, which had very devastating consequences for indigenous communities. And it's still the law of the land. It still prioritizes mining over all other land uses, allows mining companies and individuals to stake an indefinite number of claims and hold those claims for an indefinite period of time with no return to the public for the minerals that are extracted from those public lands. So there are real opportunities. The Clean Energy Mineral Reform Act was introduced last year by Representative Grijalva and Senator Heinrich. Those include important provisions to add additional protections to communities and the environment. And recently, President Biden's interagency working group on mining reform released its recommendations, and it proposed 60 different measures to update the way that mining is conducted in the United States, including a variety of additional protections for communities and the environment, and including measures that could be done without congressional action, which of course I think is particularly critical. We also want to see new mining that's done centered around the indigenous right to free, prior, and informed consent as enshrined in international law. And we see Canada moving in that direction, and certainly like to see the US follow in its footsteps. So there are a lot of important changes in terms of the way that we'd like to see things shift. In order to combat climate change, sourcing minerals in the most energy efficient way is really critical, and mining is not that. We can't mine our way to a clean energy economy. We really need to see a shift in the way that we source minerals. Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation, Bonnie, and for really just breaking it down for us. Super helpful in just framing what that looks like. We do have a couple questions from the peanut gallery. The first one, Anonymous, asks, the last slide, I'm assuming this is to you, Bonnie, discussing plastics and rubber as products being mined. Does that mean oil, gas, and coal extraction for plastics, etc.?
Yeah, my presentation is meant to talk specifically about minerals. So no, I'm not referencing those other products. It's specific to pushing for different types of transportation in order to get away from everyone having electric vehicles or multiple electric vehicles.
Gotcha. This one might be for both of you. Barbara asks, Advocates for Safe Communities in Fairbanks calculates the cost to the Alaska Department of Transportation and Public Facilities for the Manh-Choh ore haul will likely be $853 million for 5 bridge replacements replace Richardson pavement, additional lanes, additional maintenance. What is the total cost for such? What are the total for such costs for Ambler Road connecting Dalton, Elliott, Thies, Johansson, West Susanita, and Graphite 1 roads, etc.?
I have seen a couple estimates for the Ambler Road, and I haven't looked at the new draft supplemental yet, which I understand has updated costs. As I recall, and this will it was around $1.5 billion for the Ambler Road. And I understand that there were some estimates done by the National Parks Conservation Association that with inflation, they were estimating those costs to be around $2 billion. So very loosely, that's very loosely the numbers that were associated with that project, which the idea was that would be paid for through the state and then reimbursed by tolls to the mining company for its use. But there aren't any contracts in place. And I think what's important to know about Ambler is that the mineral district contains 4 mineral deposits, but there are no applications from any of those companies for a mining project yet. Those are all still deposits. And there's only been one economic feasibility study done for one of those deposits. So 4 deposits, but only one has even gone through an economic feasibility study. So really the justification for the economics of that road just simply aren't there.
Yeah, and I think you could, go ahead, Bonnie.
I was gonna say, there's some great and more detailed information about that on the Defend the Brooks Range website. I think they'll have some exact numbers from you for the road for you to look at there, and also a fact sheet that's specific to the critical minerals associated with that district. Because as I said, the reports that have been provided by the companies themselves do not demonstrate that those minerals are even economically available there.
Austin, I see you're off mute. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, the costs are staggering, right? It's hard for us to, imagine or think about like the number 1 billion, right? So 1 million seconds is like a third of a month. 1 billion seconds is 31 years, right? So the billion versus million, the costs are staggering. And those really significant costs, like, projects that cost nearly $1 billion or over $1 billion, they have really significant implications. These we'll call them roads to resources, if you will. They have the implication of impacting indigenous communities, communities like mine that are really intimately tied to ancestral areas. So there's, really significant environmental costs, socio-cultural costs to areas and communities that are just like really, really, really tied to areas that are so vastly important to their survival. And the impact to us, that's often not written into the economic analysis of these mines. And for indigenous communities that are advocating for clean waters, clean lands, no disruption to migratory birds and hunting grounds and fishing waters. As Bonnie mentioned earlier, there's legacy issues with these kinds of critical mineral mines. They will pollute the environment for thousands of years, and they require significant water management, significant mine management in order to ensure or to mitigate the effects, not get rid of the effects, just mitigate and minimize the effects.
Well said, Austin. And I was gonna mentioned the same thing. I mean, the cost is priceless, right? I mean, can't really put a price on caribou migration patterns throughout the gates of the Arctic, right? In disrupting that. We do have 10 questions here, so obviously we want to get through all of those. There's quite a lot of interest. My boss, actually, Vi Wahiyi, shout out Vi for being here. Austin, this question is for you. As a shareholder for the Native Corporation, have you heard from opposition from other shareholders?
Yeah, in fact, Adam dropped a link to an article. Folks from Brevik and Teller are mentioned there. I think opposition is growing as we're learning a little bit more about this. The mining scenario changed a little bit in the last couple of years. At first, it was a relatively small mine, and it has grown immensely now. So I think I think there's growing concern.
Doris asks or mentions, could our government offer subsidies for more recycling and reprocessing of critical minerals?
Yeah, absolutely. We're seeing through the Defense Production Act just enormous amounts of funds being provided to companies to expand their efforts at exploration. As Austin just mentioned, around the graphite project, the Department of Defense has been contributing money there. And so that could be flipped, and those funds could be used to advance recycling and promote all of these other methods of reducing the demand for those minerals by all of the things that we've talked about. So yeah, absolutely. And that's certainly something that we'd like to see, and something that we're pushing for.
Pamela Miller, Executive Director of ACAT, what changes are needed at the state and federal levels to prevent harm to communities from mining operations?
Boy, in areas that are heavily mined, there are really significant legacy pollution issues, and the threat from hard rock mines is even more considerable. Alaska's regulations aren't very good. We stripped Coastal Zone Management Authority, which allowed communities a much more direct path to involvement. We have a state system of management that of enforcement that isn't very good, especially for rural areas. And who's watchdogging mines? Typically, regulatory oversight, happens at one point in time. It's not 24/7, 365. And so there are, really significant issues of enforcement, of community involvement that really need to be changed. Yeah.
Teresa asks, is the $2 billion for Ambler just for the road, or does that include costs for upgrades to the Dalton Highway, South Central ports, etc.? Additional, and I know we talked about this a little bit, so we don't have to spend too much time on it. Bonnie, I know you mentioned that there's some estimates up in the air.
Yeah, I believe it was just for the road, but I haven't looked at it recently. I'm guessing it doesn't include those other things. And I believe that the MPCA site might have some details on that, because there's a economic analysis completed by Tom Power on their website. And so that I might point people in that direction. Yeah.
Elena asks, are there any second life uses of transition mineral mines that have been mined to completion?
I certainly hope so. If our only forethought, our only foresight about energy transition is creating lots of new mines, and with U.S. taxpayer dollars for foreign mining companies, we're eventually going to mine ourselves out of existence. I mean, we have to talk about recycling, reusing. Why aren't the critical infrastructure dollars more dedicated towards recycling, reusing? That's a question that we need to pose to the people in power.
Yeah, and I know the USGS is in the process of inventorying the waste around the US, this mine waste, and trying to um, characterize it and identify places where, if we're looking specifically for rare earths, what's the best place to look. So I know some of that is underway. But the resources dedicated to that are much less than we're seeing in terms of the resources dedicated towards particularly mining. And in particular, we're just seeing a lot of the thing that I really want to flag for people is that we're just seeing lots of effort to try and reduce protections for communities and the environment right at the point when that needs to be strengthened. So we've got the Mining Regulatory Clarity Act currently in the House that would validate mining claims without even demonstrating valuable minerals. There's the Fast 41 legislation that fast tracks mining projects and reduces communities' ability to engage and litigate. Every session we see amendments to the budget bill and national defense, and so really want to just make sure people are paying attention to that and weighing in quickly, particularly with their decision makers, because the U.S. Congress, there's a lot of things happening in this space right now, and people need to be paying attention and communicating.
Becky mentions at least $450 million for West Susanita industrial mining road in 100 miles. I mean, close to $500 million for a 100-mile road, right? I mean, that's just the beginning. Thank you for the comment. Dylan says, while legislative approaches are important, Native movement is commendable for its use of direct action to oppose mining projects. I know you guys did a road blockade, which is great, earlier this year. What other ways can we work outside of and in spite of power structures and institutions like the federal state government that are more integrated with multinational corporate interest that then separate from it?
It's a good question. I mean, Native movement really thinks about how we can do that. Native movement utilizes the tools of good old traditional advocacy as well as direct action and organizing. I think we would like to we would like to think all those things, those package of tools convince people or convince federal agencies or state agencies to do something, but I think ultimately it must involve some amount of education. Bonnie talked about this, really well earlier. How do we address the essentially the corporate greed, and how we utilize resources, and how much are we using, and can we reduce our energy use, our capitalistic tendencies to a level that doesn't cause harm. I think it's a broad, very broad concept, a very broad suite of tools that are needed, and we need to do a heck of a lot more to address how we do that.
Thank you, Austin. Desiree asked, the supplemental environmental impact statement for Ambler Road is not tied to any mining operations. It is only for the road, which includes infrastructure. How common is it for mining infrastructure permitting to be separate from the mines themselves?
I don't think it's common typically in the lower 48, but certainly something we're seeing more of in Alaska as they're trying to tap deposits or promoting deposits that are in more remote areas. Certainly, historically, a lot of the exploration in terms of transportation to explore until they actually determine that there's an economic deposit there has been, supported by air, helicopters to get in. And so explore, a major infrastructure project like this, that where at Ambler, where there are still deposits that are in exploration, there aren't even any proposals for mining. I just think it's ludicrous, the idea that anyone would spend $2 billion on a road with the just enormous impacts associated with that infrastructure at the stage that they're certainly at now at Ambler. I mean, there are, of course, broader concerns about Ambler itself and the impacts associated with it. But, if you were just looking at it through the economic lens, it just makes no sense whatsoever.
Yeah. Go ahead, Austin.
Yeah, just real quickly, unusually common in Alaska. Very frustrating, this notion of road to resources.
I was going to echo that same sentiment. I feel like, within the environmental justice work in Alaska, we're warming 4 times faster than the rest of the world. We're going to be feeling the impacts of climate change faster. And a lot of the times it's not economically feasible, right? It's not even the people who live there who are benefiting. So it's super backwards. Elena asked, also, can you talk a little bit more about the policy advocacy being done to update mining regulations from the ones we have from the 1800s? What do those strategies look like to make it less extractive to the communities displaced and impacted by mines? And who is doing this advocacy in the US?
Yeah, there's been a big effort to update the 1872 mining law for quite some time. Unfortunately, Congress is in a bit of disarray these days and difficult to get legislation through. Representative Grijalva out of New Mexico has been a long-term champion of mining reform, and so is Senator Heinrich, who's the other co-sponsor of that legislation. The bill was introduced last May, I believe. But as I said, because of the challenging makeup of Congress right now, and especially now without even a House Speaker, where I think we may see opportunities for policy improvements are those that are things that the Biden administration can do through regulations rather than waiting for Congress to take steps. And there are a lot of things that the Biden administration could do through a rulemaking, updating the regulations that the Forest Service and the BLM regulations in particular for those 2 big public land agencies, but also there are big loopholes in the Clean Water Act for mining that could be addressed, and also major improvements in terms of mineral withdrawals, in public lands management. As you all know, with the D1 lands issue up in Alaska, there's just a huge swath of public lands in which they're considering how those will be managed, and there's a lot that could be done there in terms of providing protections for subsistence resources and uses that all could be done without congressional action. Oh, and in terms of who's doing it, at a federal level, there are a lot of organizations that are promoting mining reform and regulations. It'd be tough to narrow it down, but if you send me an email, I'd be happy to send you a whole list of different groups, both at the state level and the national level.
Yeah, and again, it's something that we run into a lot with our work is ancient regulations that oversee a lot of these processes. They just haven't been touched, and the industry will take advantage of that and shortcut these processes, right? Becky asks, timeline on interagency working group recommendations. Last year, I commented.
Yeah, those came out about a month ago. And so if you Google for them, it's a big report. It contains about 60 recommendations. Thank you for commenting on them. And there are a lot of good recommendations in there. They punt to Congress a little too often, but there are definitely things that the administration could do. There are a bunch of recommendations for improvements around tribal consultation and others that would be good to see as well. So yeah, just take a look and you'll find it. If you don't, like I said, send me an email and I'll send it to you.
Another one from Desiree. Better question, with the Ambler Road and other large projects, if they receive the permitting approval, is there anything opponents can do to prevent development?
I think one opponent has done something pretty significant. That's Doyon. You know, the planned route on the eastern edge, went through Doyon Native Corporation lands, and they've come out with a statement to the effect that the land use agreement is not going to be renewed. That probably throws a big wrench in the SEIS, because the SEIS, it needs to be specific to a route, and if it can't be specific to that route, I think that's they got to go back to the drawing board. But like in the larger context, what can people do? People can comment. There are tools available on how we can do that, how folks can best you make comments on these really complicated projects. I think the one thing that I'll stress is that we should provide comments that make a difference, and provide comments that tell our story. And I think those kinds of comments really can go a long way.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like with how Pebble was stopped under provisions for the Clean Water Act. So I think that's a double-edged sword too. I mean, not saying the Clean Water Act is perfect by any means, but there are provisions in place that we can have these victories that we should uplift and celebrate as well. Carla asks, hello, and thank you for the valuable presentations. Are mining companies willing to discuss higher international standards on mining or Indigenous people's rights to FPIC when being challenged by communities on these projects?
Yeah, FPIC. Oh, go ahead, Austin.
Just real quickly, free, prior, informed consent. I think mining companies, from time to time, the big ones do entertain like an outside viewpoint or some kind of peer-reviewed, viewpoint. But what often happens is, those peer reviews or other kinds of consultations, typically don't go very well, and they're very frustrating. And the prevailing viewpoint, the presumption of the mining company is usually what is upheld.
Yeah, and I'll just mention Canada, because FPIC, the free, prior, and informed consent, is enshrined in the international law UNDRIP, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and Canada recently endorsed it. And so we're seeing First Nations there trying to implement FPIC, and it'll be really interesting to see how that how successful that is in terms of them having control and being able to give consent or not consent. Look to Canada to see how well that's being implemented there.
Okay, we have 3 questions left. I realizing we only have 2 minutes left in this presentation. We'll go ahead and get these questions answered if Bonnie and Austin are cool with that.
Yep.
I do want to mention too that this has been a program of CHE Alaska, Collaborative for Health and the Environment. It's a program of Alaska Community Action on Toxics. It's also part of CHE, Collaborative for Healthy Environment's broader network of 5,000 individuals across the globe, providing environmental health news across the lifespan. We will have relevant links and everything sent to your inbox following this presentation, so you can stream this webinar on demand whenever you'd like. And let's go ahead and get through these questions. Thank you for being here. Terry asks, has there been any statistics of economic refugees that result from these projects? It seems a lot of houseless folks have ended up here in Anchorage through loss of fishing access.
Well, in rural parts of Alaska, especially where I'm from, our whole region already has a significant housing crisis. And when transient workers, a lot of them, like where these kinds of mines come in, housing, the housing environment is significantly impacted, and we end up with really significant and really bad housing crises with extraordinary cost of living, extraordinary cost of housing, and unfortunately, these transient workers that come from outside also impact a really significant part of our health and welfare for Native people, Indigenous people, and that's missing, murdered Indigenous people. The kind of violence and social ills that come from a lot of people coming in for these temporary jobs, these seasonal jobs. Are there statistics? Yes, there are. I can't name it off my head, but I think if you Google some of that stuff, that there's resources there. But most importantly, Indigenous communities really feel the brunt of transient workers.
Yeah, and Austin really well said that a lot of these mining infrastructure camps that sprout up, right, have super negative effects to the surrounding Native communities. So I really appreciate you highlighting that. We have a few more questions here. Barbara says, Manh Choh does not plan to remove silver and copper, just the gold from the ore. Can these be removed rather than thrown away with the acid generating tailings? Is there a way to force companies to remove valuable minerals rather than throwing them away, which contaminate the environment?
Well, I'm not a mining engineer, so I can't answer that specifically. There are usually processes that could be added to extract additional minerals. Whether that could be done economically, that's difficult to say. I don't know of any mechanism that the government could use to require them to produce those, to process for those other minerals. But yeah, good question.
Yeah, it's real quickly, these ore bodies, they have really significant legacy issues that are very hard to overcome. Mining, hard rock mining, the kind of mining that we're talking about, involves really significant, legacy, 1,000-year kind of legacy issues that are really harmful to the environment. These ore bodies have, the potential to generate acid, and as Bonnie talked about, the ability to leach really toxic materials.
Yeah, and again, bring it back to how Alaska is at the forefront of climate change. I mean, we know that persistent organic pollutants travel on ocean to wind currents and bioaccumulate in subsistence foods, right? Another piece of the puzzle. It's just a super common kind of thing that just happens, and more awareness needs to be brought upon to talk about the climate change and how it's affecting Alaska. I think Ukdiaktivik is actually funding money to get a seawall built, which I am in support of making sure infrastructure is in place to prevent these communities from literally drowning. But it's kind of dystopian that these conversations have to take place. So just a couple more to get through here. Dan Cannon says, thanks, ACAT, for hosting this great conversation. And thank you to Austin and Bonnie for your expertise. Thank you, Dan, for the words. And then just one from Pam as well. How can multinational corporations be held accountable for harms to communities, recognizing that many mining corporations are Canadian, and they often have horrible environmental and human rights records throughout the world?
Yeah, that it's challenging. That's certainly the case. I think one thing that we see is that there's just a lot more communication happening from between communities everywhere, where people are exchanging experiences about what companies have done in their area, which has made it easier to hold companies accountable in other places. So that kind of communication has, I think, really improved dramatically. The other thing that I think we've seen effectively used in some cases is going to the company's shareholder meetings and using investor strategies to inform investors and shareholders about their track record on the ground. We're seeing an increasing number of investment companies concerned about the social and economic effects of mining and deciding where they want their funds invested. And so that can be an effective tool in terms of holding a company accountable by participating in their shareholder meeting and communicating with investors.
Well, that's all the questions that we have. I do want to thank you both for being here, Bonnie and Austin, for taking part in this conversation and bringing to light how mining industry shortcuts some of these important public processes in permitting to national security, right? Was there anything else you guys wanted to cap the discussion with? Any final thoughts?
Yeah, great discussion. Thank you. And I appreciate folks that ask questions, and onwards, as they say.
Yes, thank you for having us.
All right, we'll leave it there. Make sure you tune into Che Alaska's calls throughout the end of the year. And like I said, we'll make sure to have relevant links sent directly to your inbox. And take care, guys. We'll see you next time.
See you.